Likutei Sichos, Chelek Chav Ches, volume 28, the first Sicha of Parshas Pinchas. This Sicha will explain the three manners in which we acquired Eretz Yisrael, and also how it parallels to the three aspects of our connection with our Kadosh Baruch Hu. And it will focus on and explain something which we say every single day in our pre-Shachris prayers, and that is Ashreinu Matov Chalkeinu Umanoim Gorelenu Umayofa Yerushaseinu. So to be more prepared for the Sicha, it's worthwhile to familiarize ourselves with the verses in our Parsha, beginning with verse 52 in chapter 26 and on, which talks about the conquest, the Yerusha, the inheritance, the conquest, and the division of Eretz Yisrael. And following that, preceding this story, these instructions, comes the story of the daughters of Tzlafchad who came to demand also a portion of Israel inheritance, and the laws of inheritance are described here in detail. Several things to be familiar with to be able to flow through the Sikha better. Minyan HaMitzvahs, the codifying of mitzvahs. So now in general we know, and this is a age-old tradition, that we have 613 mitzvahs. However, when you look at the Torah has many, many, many commandments, many do's, many don'ts. So how exactly do we term the mitzvahs? Now you have the great codifiers, for example, the most famous one, the Rambam, who has a sefer called Sefer HaMitzvahs, in which he codifies the 613 mitzvahs based on a certain formula. You have the Sefer Mitzvahs Gedolos and so on. There are many, several of that era who codified the mitzvahs. Now, there's a special formula as to what counts as a mitzvah and what not. Also, you understand that the Rambam, everything he wrote was very accurate, very exact, very precise. So even his choice of order in the mitzvahs certainly doesn't follow the order in which it was said in the Torah. That also is very telling. Another thing to be familiar with, the idea of a goyrol, a lottery. We find it's in several instances in the Torah, in several observances, that a lottery is called for. What does this really mean? This means that this is something that's going to be determined in a manner that's l'mayla mitam v'das, beyond any whatsoever logic or rationale. In other words, so to speak, it's totally up to Hashem himself for whatever reason he has. Then there's another thing to be familiar with, the difference between a mecher and a matana. A sale, a transaction in which you acquire something through buying it, or versus a matana, a gift. What is the difference? Well, generally speaking, the sale, the fact that I, the buyer, acquires the item, is everything about me, my contribution. Me, the buyer, since I paid for it, since I've contributed whatever it is that I had to contribute, therefore I was able now to acquire this item. Versus a gift, it's totally up to and dependent on the das, on the, so to speak, decision of the giver. You cannot come and demand a present. You cannot come and demand for someone to gift you something. Rather, it's typically on their own free will, on their will, their decision to this, because they like you, because they're happy with you, because they want to please you, whatever it may be the reason, but they are the ones that make the decision. So it's coming from them, from the giver. So again, a purchase is coming really through the actions, through the contribution, the accomplishment of the recipient, versus the present is really coming as a result of the actions, the decision, the contribution of the giver. However, on a very deep level, even a gift, when one receives a gift, although we just said that it comes exclusively from the das of the giver, yet even a gift somewhat is dependent on the contribution, on the action, so to speak, of the recipient. Why? As the Gemara says, that if not for the person, the recipient of the gift, if not for them having done something to please the giver, then they wouldn't have had given them this gift. In other words, they wouldn't have been triggered to give them the gift. That means there's something that also the recipient is contributing, albeit in a very, very esoteric manner. Another thing to be familiar with, the concept of bechira, of choice. And it's explained in Chassidus, the true meaning of choice. It means true, real choice is when everything is equal, meaning there's no whatsoever logic or reason or rationale to choose one thing over the other, to go with one over the other. Rather, they're all perfectly equal and have the same exact meaning and have the same exact contribution, and yet, for whatever reason, beyond any rationale, one chooses this over that. In other words, there is no compelling reason to choose one over the other. That's where the true and absolute meaning of choice really fits in. Another thing to be familiar with, a Yerusha, an inheritance. An inheritance is not a sale, and it doesn't go into the category of sale, of transaction. It does not go into the category of a gift. Rather, what it is because what's called testator, meaning the recipient of the thing, the person who's getting the inheritance, he is because of the heir is part of the testator, meaning the cause of the heir is one with the one who's giving it, leaving the inheritance. Therefore, automatically, b'derech memela, innately, he receives the thing. Let's go into the Sikha. So in the Minyan HaMitzvahs of the Rambam quotes the very last mitzvah of the 613 mitzvahs as the mitzvah of Nachalis, which is all the rules of inheritance, as quoted in this parsha, and he quotes the pasuk Ish ki yamu suvein loy. He says, as it says, if a man dies and he has no son, and hence the connection of this Sikha our parsha. Now we know, as we said in the introduction, that certainly even the order in the Rambam is very exact, very precise. The fact that he chose this as the very last halach, as the very last mitzvah of the 613 mitzvahs, has to tell us something. Obviously, it's there to tell us something. And this is, of course, parallel to the fact that we see very clearly and obviously that his choice for the first mitzvah is the one of the fundamental obligation of every Yid to believe in Hashem. And there it's obvious and clear, because that is the foundation of everything. So, likewise, there must be that this mitzvah, this final mitzvah of inheritance, kind of wraps up and is the completion, like a conclusion of all the mitzvahs. Now, at first glance, perhaps we can suggest, well, there's an obvious, simple reason why the Rambam did it, because since the mitzvah of inheritance comes after one's life, it's, so to speak, in the afterlife of the testator, therefore, the Rambam put it last. But that's not a sufficient reason. There has to be something deeper. Why? Because in the course of the 613 mitzvahs, there are many mitzvahs which pertain to one's afterlife. For example, the mitzvah of burying a Jew is already mentioned way before. So that cannot be the reason. There has to be something deeper. And the Rebbe says, perhaps the answer is that the Rambam's choice for the final mitzvah parallels the very last Mishnah in the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. In all the six sections of the Mishnah, the very last Mishnah is the Mishnah says, Omer Reb Shua ben Levi, Osid HaKadosh Baruch Hu lahanchil chol tzadik v'tzadik shai elamis. That Hashem in the future will give to inherit, meaning He will give as an inheritance, as a possession to every single tzaddik, 310 worlds. Shenemar lahanchil oyev hayesh. And in other words, the very last Mishnah, the very last halacha in the whole Shas talks about the laws of inheritance, a certain sense of inheritance, the idea of nachla. And that's why perhaps the Rambam did it. And Mefarshim explain that why is it that this is the very, very final Mishnah in the six starim of the Mishnayos? Because this is like a tashlum schar. This is like speaking about the reward which comes after the completion, the end of the entire avodah throughout all the generations, the avodah of Torah mitzvahs. And therefore, the Mishnah uses the expression of inheritance because it comes post this life as we know it now. Likewise, that could be the reason. The Rambam completes the whole order of the 613 mitzvahs with this one, because this is talking about the future which comes after, at the end, at the completion, at the conclusion of the avodah of doing all the 613 mitzvahs, and that's why he speaks about the mitzvah of nachala at the very end as the last mitzvah. To understand this better, let's take a look. As we said in the introduction, this parsha about the laws of nachlois, the laws of inheritance, actually precedes the topic that's mentioned in the Torah, the topic that discusses the Yerushas v'chalukas haaretz, the inheritance or the conquest and the division of Eretz Yisrael. Now, when you take a look at there, says the Rebbe, in general, you can divide it. When you break it down, you see in the Torah that there are three expressions that are used in regards to the conquest, to the receiving, to the division, to the, so to speak, ownership that each Shevet got in Eretz Yisrael. And perhaps you can say they're divided into three particular ideas. One is Yerushas Haaretz, literally the inheritance, which means the conquest of the land. Then, phase 2, second aspect, Chalukas Haaretz, the division of the land, as prescribed in the Parsha. The Torah says, Lorav, Tarbu, Nachalosai, to a larger tribe, you're going to give a larger parcel of land, a larger geographic location. To a smaller tribe, you're going to give less. This division is one that fits into rationale. There is a certain logic to it, right? You give more to the person who needs more space, you give less to the person who needs less space. Then, the Torah says that there is a chalukas haaretz, a division of the land, al pi hagoyrol, in accordance with the lottery. And as we said in the introduction, meaning there is an aspect of receiving Eretz Yisrael which is l'maylo mitavadas, beyond any whatsoever rationale. Now, what is really the reason why all these three were necessary in the occupation and the receiving of the land? So the Rebbe says, because the receiving of Eretz Yisrael as our land, as an inheritance for the Jewish people, is not just simply that Hashem chose for us a nice, beautiful geographic location where we can live, but rather that this place has an inherent connection, a unique connection to Hashem, like Hashem says himself, that the eyes of Hashem are there from the beginning, I mean throughout all times, even though Hashem is all over the world, but Hashem says in particular, this place has a very special place in my heart. In Shmuel Aleph, we find a reference to Eretz Yisrael as Nachlas Hashem. This is the inheritance, this is the estate of Hashem. So therefore, Hashem giving it to the Yidden is not just merely because he gave him a piece of land, but he gave him something that was unique to him, because this is a means of expression of the unique and special connection, the bond that we have with Hashem, and that's why it gets expressed in us receiving Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, just like we mentioned, we find three aspects in the receiving of and the division, the receiving of Eretz Yisrael. Likewise, our connection with Hashem also gets expressed in three aspects, parallel ones. As we say in the morning, as we lead up to the davening, in the Shacharis, the pre-Shacharis, we say, Ashreinu matov chalkeinu. Ashreinu means, how lucky are we? Matov chalkeinu, how great is our portion? How good is our portion? Umanoyim goreleinu, and how pleasant is our lot? Goyrel, lot, right? Lottery. Umayafa Yerushaseinu, and how beautiful is our heritage, our inheritance. Now, the fact that Yerushaseinu, the inheritance, comes here last, tells us that this is actually the greater one of all three. Now, what really is the difference between the difference between, and meaning, that is, between these three expressions? Hashem Techalkeinu, Goraleinu, it's Yiddishkeit, we're connected to Hashem. In other words, really one could even ask a question. How is it possible to refer to our connection with Hashem as Yerushaseinu, as our inheritance, as our heritage? The fact is that the idea of inheritance, by definition, means that we said, like you said before, that the estate or the person from whom it's coming from is dead. It's not shaykh. It's not even possible to say such a thing. Hashem is the ultimate existence of life, right? So why is it that we refer to this as Yerusha Seinu. What does that mean? And what does Chelkeinu mean? Goyraleinu. How does that apply to Yiddishkeit? So the Rebbe says, let's focus in and first take Chelkeinu and Goyraleinu, our portion and our lot, and understand what they mean. In a sense, they parallel, that is, the difference between transaction, a sale, and a gift. Chelkeinu, when we say that Yiddishkeit is our portion, that parallels the idea of mecher, of a sale, which, like we said in the introduction, the reason for the sale, the reason for the buyer now having the ability to take ownership on this item is exclusively because of the contribution of the buyer. That he made a payment, he made an investment, whatever it is. And likewise, Chelkeinu refers to the aspect of Yiddishkeit, of our connection to Hashem, which we achieve all the various blessings, all the various emanations and so on, which comes as a result of our avodah, what we contribute, our input. Whereas Goyraleinu, our lot, this parallels the idea of matana, of a gift. This represents the emanations, the brachas, the various holy lights that we get, that comes from Hashem's desire. Exclusively because Hashem did chose so. Bechira, Hashem's choice, so to speak, his free choice, that nothing compels him, not our avodah, not anything. It comes from a place that is beyond being impacted by our avodah. And this is like a gift, right? That comes exclusively from the will of the gifter, of the person giving the gift. Interesting, on a deeper level we can explain that Chelkeinu represents not only the connection through our avodah, but rather, moreover, it represents the connection of the essence of our being, that we are connected to Hashem. In other words, so to speak, that we are in essence connected to Hashem, like the Alter Rebbe says in the second perek of Tanya, right in the beginning, "V'nefesh Hashenis b'Yisrael Chelek elakam imal mamish," that the second soul is literally a part of Hashem, or it's the pasuk that he quotes there, "Chelek avaya amoy," that we're like part of Hashem. Now, even though this is a bond, an essential bond, but yet Goyraleinu is much higher than it. Why is that? Because the fact that we are Chelkeinu, that we are part of Hashem, that we have our lot, our portion, as a result of us being children of Hashem, which means we're one with Hashem, but it's still about us. In other words, when do you have this idea that compels that the father is connected? When there is a son. So there's something, so to speak, separate, something outside, something already less than the father himself. In other words, even though it's not dependent on our avodah so much on this level of explanation, but still it's coming, so to speak, something from us. Versus Goyraleinu, this comes exclusively from Hashem. This is from a place where Hashem, so to speak, doesn't even consider this idea that the neshama is one with Hashem. It's a place of godliness which is beyond that. And over there, Hashem yet made a choice, so to speak, like a free choice, like parallel to the idea of gift, that he decided that he wants to be connected to us, that he gives us to us. And he has a relationship with us, and thus we have Yiddishkeit, and we're connected to Hashem. So now, as we stand now, well, Goyraleinu is obviously, not only is it higher than Chelkeinu, our lot is not only greater than our portion, but it seems to be the ultimate. What could there be greater than this? Well, the fact is that, remember what we said about gifting, that even though, yes, indeed, it comes from the desire, it comes from the decision, the will of the gifter, but still at some level, at some point, there's a consideration of what the recipient had contributed, right? Like we said, if you're not for him making the person happy or feeling good or feeling pleasant, then they would have never given them the gift. Therefore, even Goyraleinu is not the ultimate. What is the ultimate? The third aspect, Yerusha Seinu, the idea of Yerusha, the idea of the inheritance. What is an inheritance? We know that the Yoresh, the person, the heir, is Oimeid b'mokem ha'moirish, that he literally is in the place, he stands in the place, I'm just translating the words literally, of the testator. Meaning that it's not two separate things that one is receiving from the other, two separate entities, but rather it's one continuous entity. And that explains why, by the way, even a baby that was just born inherits, or if his father died, inherits all his father's estate, even though he has no capacity of doing anything or contributing anything in any whatsoever way. So it comes out from this that Yerusha is greater even than sale and a gift. Because sale and gift is an idea of giving, an idea of hashpah, but it's not that you're giving to someone, but it's not coming from within, from the essence, from the just mere existence of the person. Whereas Yerusha is the person's not giving anything. It's just the mere existence is a continuation of Hashem's existence. And that represents our connection to Hashem, which goes beyond even Goyr Aleinu. And this, now just to spell it out, is how Yerusha Seinu is greater than Chelkenu and Goyr Aleinu. Chelkenu is our connection to Hashem, as Hashem contracted himself, so to speak, to such a point that our avodah, our contribution, plays a role to some degree and can affect things. Goyr Aleinu is where Hashem chose us. Now, of course, like we said before, this represents a level in godliness which is before even the Tzimtzum, and over there we don't play a role at all, and therefore there's no compelling reason for Hashem, not even a godly reason, so to speak, to choose to pick us. Rather, it's purely His choice. It's purely His choice. As we said, the idea of the giver of the gift. However, the fact that He chose us, meaning that we do play some role on some level, because He made the choice of us. He picked us. So therefore the us, does play a role of existence. So there's something, so to speak, kiviyachol, outside of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, somewhat. However, by Yerusha Seinu, over there, it's the ultimate and innate bond with Hashem, that, so to speak, He and us were just one thing. We're just one thing. Now, these three things, these three aspects of our connection to Hashem, can actually, says the Rebbe, we can see also how it plays out in our history. How in our history you also have these three time periods. What are they? You have pre-Matan Torah, post-Matan Torah, post the giving of the Torah, and then la'asid lavoi, the time when Mashiach will come. You see, pre-Matan Torah, what happened? It says we're called Banim. Banim. We were called sons, like children. Where do we see that? When Hashem sent Moshe to Paray, what did He say? Tell him, Beni b'chayru Yisrael. This is my firstborn son. And as we said above, that once you have a son, that compels to say that there is a father, that it's connected to the father, right? And that means that from the son, you recognize the father. And therefore, it's coming from who? Like Chelkenu, when we say our portion, it's somewhat coming from us. This is pre-Matan Torah. And this is, by the way, why we see, where is this reflected? The mitzvahs that the Avos did, our ancestors prior to Matan Torah, although they were holy endeavors, they didn't have any effect because it was coming purely from us. Then you have post-Matan Torah. Post-Matan Torah is when we say, Uvanu v'charta mikol am v'loshen, that you chose us from all nations. Hashem chose us. And this expresses the, so to speak, gifting coming from Hashem, purely on His decision, purely in His choice, right? And this is now, this set in motion, the avodah of Bnei Yisrael of doing the mitzvahs. And that's why now, Hashem chose us, so now when we do a mitzvah, it does have an effect. It has a very good effect. It actually just changes the world. It has an effect on the world. But then, there is the ultimate time period, the ultimate phase, which is going to be after the completion of all the Torah mitzvahs, that then there will be the revelation of the essential greatness, of the innate greatness of Am Yisrael, and that's why it's going to be just even higher than what we have now, higher than the need for Avodah, and it's going to be pure Tashlum Gemul, it's going to be the time of reward and the revelation of godliness, even beyond anything that we've ever experienced, because that is the inyan of Yerusha Seinu, of in our existence and our connection to Hashem.